This is Miss Brittany here, just giving a brief overview of some stuff from Chapter 8 about patterns of inheritance and the basics of genetics. So, you're going to hear a lot about Mendel in this chapter, and he's kind of always associated with genetics. So, basically, before Mendel, people thought that your genes were kind of like a soup, or yeah, that's probably the best analogy I can come up with. I'm not good with those. So basically they thought that you got some from mom, you got something from dad, you throw it in and you get this perfect 50-50 mix, right? They thought that our traits were blended, almost as if you put them in a blender making a smoothie. That was before they understood what really was happening at the genetic level, which we now, of course, through research can actually see. But back then, Mendel was kind of having to work with only what he could see and hypothesize from that information. So he came up with these two concepts, continuous and discontinuous variation, and I'll read the book definition, then I'll explain. Continuous variation is the range of small differences we see among individuals in a characteristic like human height. It does appear that offspring are a blend of traits, but it was because of his work with discontinuous variation that he was able to realize that that's not the case. So continuous variation is kind of like basically what happens when there's a very small difference, like when you take into fact human height, all the small differences coming together is continuous, it stays the same. If it's discontinuous, is different. Mendel mainly worked with these discontinuous variation traits, and they're easily distinguishable. So, for example, let me make this simpler. If you have like a pea plant, or well, that's why partially he liked the pea plants, because they did have discontinuous variation, and that helps prove his theory. Discontinuous is when you can tell a difference. So think discontinuous. I think I spelled that right. Oh, enormous fun. Think different. So this is like black versus white. Continuous variation versus discontinuous would kind of be like if you took the black plus the white and you blended it together and got gray. So continuous variation is hard to tell the difference. So of what came from where. So like the white, the black, they both come together where you get gray. So of course if you see that, you think, well, you have a common 50-50 situation going on there. It's like throwing them in a blender. So that wasn't helping Mendel's cause, because this is what people already thought. So Mendel was trying to prove this wrong. He was trying to say, no, they're not a blender. There's something else going on. So he worked with discontinuous variation that you could see distinctly two different traits. They didn't look blended, because that helped prove his point. Okay, on with that. So, all right. So Mendel developed these crosses to determine kind of like probabilities, and if you've taken any kind of statistics or probability, you know that probability is just the chance of something happening, so the likelihood of that outcome. So by developing, developing these crosses, he was able to predict the outcomes of the offspring from each generation. So, and they were based on ratios, which are fractions of a certain amount out of another certain amount. And he started with the parental offspring. So it started with the parent. The next generation was called the F1 and then the F2. And the F stands for filial. So this is first filial, second filial. Now, the parental plants Yeah, it looks like, So, hybridization, what is that? Okay. So that's another tool Mendel used. And that's just two true breeding individuals that have different traits. That's basically taking two organisms of the same species. So they can breed together, but they have different traits. Well, the problem with the pea plant was he was wanting to do violet versus white. Well, the pea plant is self-pollinating. It pollinated itself. So if the plant's pollinating itself and it's violet, it's only going to produce violet. If it's pollinating with itself and it's white, it's only going to produce white. So he wanted to blend them. So he had to do a hybridization, and he would take the pollen from this white and put it on the violet, or take the pollen from the violet and put it on the white in that parental generation. What came as a result, the offspring, was the first filial generation. And from then on, they were going to self-pollinate. So the first parental were hybridized. The rest were self-pollinated because they were officially, their genes have been blended now. Let's see. So I'm going on to the next page here. So on page 100, it kind of gives you a picture overview of what happened in each generation. So the violet was the dominant trait. The white is recessive. So violet will always be dominant over white. So he took some pollen from this guy, put it here. Took some pollen from this guy, put it here. He hybridized them. All right, now they're going to self-fertilize like they normally do. And this is the outcome. So in this specific one, and this pattern will always happen when we're talking about incomplete dominance. I'm sorry, we're talking about complete dominance or incomplete, but we'll get to that. I haven't defined that, so I won't say that. So whenever we're talking about these true breeding plants being crossed, this is going to always be the outcome. It is predictable. Even if it's not these pea plants and it's something else, it's still going to have this 3-to-1 outcome that we're going to get to. So this is the dominant, this is the recessive. So what happened was all the heterodominant violet came to be. And so that made the white disappear. What does that mean? I'm going to explain. So let's draw it in like a chart form. So for example, in that parental generation, you had the violet. So the capital V is violet, the dominant, and the little v is the white, which was recessive. So you're mixing a violet plant with a white. So if I blend these together, they are all going to be this. They are different, so one's big, one's little, so that means it's hetero. If they were both capital or both lowercase, it would be homo, same. And so these are hetero. And the hetero, because you have this dominant trait with the recessive trait, it's going to take on the dominant form. So if all of these are hetero, they are all going to be violet. So this is the F1 generation. So in that F1 generation, they were all violet. It looked like the white had disappeared. So it looked like, okay, well, the violet's dominant. It took control. There's no more white. Well, what happened was when the plant self-fertilized again into this F2 generation, the outcome brought back the white. And so what happened was it's self-fertilizing. So this is what we have now. This hetero with a hetero. And so when we work that out, we get so this is dominant homozygous dominant because they're both the same size, so it's homozygous, and is dominant if they're capitalized. These are the same also, so they will also be homozygous, but they're both lowercase, so it's recessive. Versus these are what we saw before, which is the heterozygous. So what we just defined is the genotype. So all those words, those three things make the genotype. We can use that information about that genotype to determine the phenotype. And the phenotype is the actual trait, what we see. So that would be the color, violet or white. So the phenotype would be how many are white and how many are violet. Well, on this information, so if it's homozygous dominant, the dominant is violet, so this will be violet. We know that heterozygous takes the dominant form also, so violet, violet, violet. And this is homozygous recessive. There's no violet, it's only white. So we have 3 violet and 1 white, which gives us a ratio of 3 to 1. And that will always be the case. So if you're talking, if there's a test question is asking you about the different generations from the parent to the first to the second filial of true breeding self-pollinating plants, it will be 3 to 1 in the answer as the ratio. 3 dominant to 1 recessive. So the dominant, I guess you could think of it as like 3 times more powerful than the recessive. Hope that helps a little bit in explaining that.